I've lived in Ravenwood my entire life. It's not a big town, tucked away between thick woods and rolling fields that stretch far beyond the horizon, but it's home. There's a quiet sort of charm here, especially in the fall. When the leaves turn gold and red and the air starts to cool, it feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when the town begins preparing for the Harvest Festival, an event that's been held for as long as anyone can remember, maybe longer. It's the heart of Ravenwood's traditions, tied to the land, the crops, and, though most people don't like to talk about it, the strange things that happen this time of year. I work at the only bar in town, the Rusty Pitchfork, where most of the locals gather after a long day's work. I'm the evening bartender, which means I hear everything. Ravenwood is a small place, and when you're behind the counter long enough, people trust you with their stories, their secrets. My boss, Dave, the owner, works the morning shift, and while we cross paths occasionally, I'm usually left alone with the night's crowd. The bar's regulars have known me for years. They've seen me grow up, seen me take over this job after high school, and most of them think of me as just another part of the town's fixtures. It's a quiet life, and I like it that way. But this year, as Halloween approaches, there's a feeling in the air that's different. A tension, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. Something isn't right. And it's not just the unease that always comes with the festival. The Harvest Festival has always been the pride of Ravenwood. Held the weekend before Halloween, it's a celebration of the town's agricultural roots, a time when the community comes together to enjoy the fruits of their labor and welcome the changing of the seasons. The streets are lined with pumpkin displays, booths selling hot cider and baked goods, and children carving jack-o'-lanterns with wide smiles as the crisp autumn air fills the town. There's laughter and music, the smell of roasted corn and freshly baked pies hanging heavy in the air. For as long as anyone can remember, the festival has been the heart of the town's identity. Every year, families gather to decorate scarecrows and display them around their homes, fields, and roads. The stories say the scarecrows were once offerings, left in the fields to appease ancient forces that protected the crops. Over the years, those tales became folklore, forgotten whispers of a time when the people believed in the spirits of the land. Now, the scarecrows are nothing more than festival decorations, the remnants of a bygone era. The older generation sometimes talks about the origins of the festival, how the settlers in Ravenwood used to leave gifts in the fields, fresh produce, small trinkets, even handmade dolls, to ensure a good harvest the following year. They say the spirits of the land, unseen and ancient, would watch over the crops, and as long as the offerings were made, Ravenwood would flourish. But like most old traditions, these stories have been reduced to folklore, passed down by grandparents to their grandchildren as spooky bedtime tales. No one really believes them anymore. This year, something felt different. The pumpkins in the fields, usually vibrant and plump, have begun to rot seemingly overnight, their once bright orange skins collapsing into dark, oozing husks. The crops, which should have been at their peak, are withering on the vine, turning brittle and brown as if touched by some unseen blight. The scarecrows, once symbols of the harvest, now stand ominously at the edges of the fields, their straw bodies sagging and limp, but there's something about them that feels wrong. The townspeople are whispering about it, though they try to laugh it off as paranoia. But I've heard the murmurs late at night, in the dim light of the bar, theories that the scarecrows have started moving on their own. It began as idle gossip. Someone would mention seeing a scarecrow in a different spot than where it had been placed the day before. They'd shrug it off, assuming someone had moved it, but no one ever admitted to doing it. Then the stories got darker. People claimed the scarecrows were following them, turning their heads to watch as they passed by. At first, it was dismissed as festival jitters. After all, it's easy for a town to work itself into a frenzy around Halloween. But the mood has changed. There's a heaviness in the air, a sense of unease that lingers like a chill, even in the middle of the day. Old Pete was a regular at the bar, and normally a quiet man. He'd sit in the corner, nursing a whiskey, and tell anyone who'd listen about the old days when Ravenwood was a bustling farm town. But one night, something had him spooked. He came in just as we were about to close, practically stumbling through the door, his eyes wide and wild. "Pete," I said, wiping down the bar as he sat on a stool. "You look tense." He didn't respond at first, just stared into his drink after I poured him a shot of bourbon. I watched him closely, trying to figure out what had rattled him so badly. Finally, after what felt like forever, he spoke. "I heard it," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Out in the field, the scarecrow." I raised an eyebrow. "Heard what?" "It talked to me," he said, his hands shaking so hard the glass rattled on the counter. "It called my name." Now, I've heard my fair share of crazy stories in this town. Late-night drunks tend to spin tall tales, but Pete wasn't the type to make things up, especially not like this. He downed his drink in one gulp, then looked up at me, his eyes full of fear. "I was checking the field," he continued, his voice hoarse. "Hearing strange noises. Thought it was just the wind, or maybe some damn kids playing a prank. But when I got close..." The scarecrow turned its head just a little and I heard it whisper. It knew things about me, things I've never told anyone. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Pete, you sure you weren't imagining things? It's late and..." "I wasn't imagining it," he snapped, his voice rising with panic. "I swear on everything, it was talking to me." I didn't know what to say, so I poured him another drink. He stayed there for a long time, mumbling to himself, his eyes never leaving the door as if expecting that scarecrow to follow him into the bar. Eventually, he stumbled out into the night, leaving me alone with the unsettling feeling that something more was going on. That night, after I finished my shift, I headed out to my car and drove away. The road was quiet, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, but Pete's story lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of him sitting at the bar, shaking, convinced that the scarecrow had spoken to him. As I drove home, passing the pumpkin fields, I felt an unease settle in. The town was quiet, but too quiet. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows over the road. That's when I saw the scarecrow. It was supposed to be in the middle of the field, a harmless decoration that had been there since the start of the season. But now, it stood in the middle of the road, directly in front of my car. My heart jumped into my throat and I swerved to avoid it, my tires screeching on the asphalt. When I looked in the rearview mirror, my hands shaking on the wheel, the scarecrow had turned to face me. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as if it were watching me drive away. I hit the gas, not stopping until I was home, my heart racing. I spent most of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it had just been my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong. The next morning, I drove back to the pumpkin field to see for myself. I parked on the side of the road and walked out to where the scarecrow should have been. It was back in its usual place, standing in the middle of the field as if nothing had happened. But something was off. The straw hands were covered in dirt, as if it had dragged itself across the ground during the night. I didn't stay long. The whole place felt wrong, like the air itself was heavy with something I couldn't name. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of the other scarecrows in the neighboring fields. Their heads were all turned, facing the road, as if watching me. I went straight to the bar after that, needing the familiarity of work to take my mind off what I'd seen. The day passed uneventfully, and for a few hours, I almost managed to convince myself that it had all been in my head. I was closing up, locking the front door and shutting off the lights when I noticed something strange in the alley behind the bar. At first I thought it was a shadow, or maybe a pile of trash, but when I looked closer, I realized it was a scarecrow, its straw hat flapping slightly in the breeze. I frowned, trying to figure out how it had gotten there. Maybe someone from the festival committee had moved it as a prank. But then it moved. Just a little, just enough for me to notice. The scarecrow had shifted closer to the back door. I locked the door as fast as I could, bolted to my car, and drove off. The next day I had to work the early shift, as Dave had something to do in the morning. When I got to the bar, I found straw scattered inside the bar. It led from the back door to the counter, where I discovered a small carved pumpkin. My name had been scratched into its skin, jagged and uneven. I threw the pumpkin out, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The days passed slowly after that, each one a strange mix of unease and routine. The bar stayed busy in the evenings as people in town gathered to talk about the upcoming harvest festival. Despite the strange happenings, the festival had to go on. But I couldn't shake what had happened. The scarecrow in the alley, the pumpkin with my name on it, it gnawed at me, a shadow in the back of my mind. It was late one evening after another long shift at the bar that things escalated. I was driving home, the streets quiet and empty. The town's decorations for the festival were nearly complete. Pumpkins and scarecrows lined the roads and fields, their ragged clothes fluttering in the cool autumn breeze. As I turned the corner to my house, I stopped dead in my tracks. A scarecrow stood in my front yard. I didn't own one. There was no reason for it to be there, but there it was, its straw arms raised toward the house. The figure was crude, like most scarecrows, made of rough, stitched-together sacks of cloth stuffed with straw. But its posture unnerved me. The way its head was tilted, as though it was looking directly at my front door, made my stomach twist. I parked the car in the driveway, and I hesitated for a moment, then rushed inside, locking the door behind me. For the first time in years, I bolted all the locks. I spent the rest of the night pacing, listening for any sign of movement outside. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside set me on edge. The next morning, the scarecrow was gone, but there were deep scratch marks on my front door, as if something had tried to claw its way in during the night. Bits of straw and fabric were scattered across the yard, the same kind used to make the scarecrows. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, my heart heavy with dread. Over the next few days, the scarecrow kept coming back. Every time I left the bar late at night, it would be there, standing just a little closer to the house. At first, it was by the tree at the edge of the yard, then by the front steps, its straw limbs hanging at odd angles. Each morning, it would be gone again, leaving only bits of straw and dirt behind. No one else seemed to notice. The town was buzzing with excitement over the festival, and though there was still talk about the crops withering and the pumpkins rotting, no one paid much attention to the scarecrows anymore. They were part of the decorations after all. Only old Pete, who had stopped coming to the bar altogether, seemed to care, but I couldn't ignore it. The scarecrow wasn't just watching me anymore. It was getting closer, and I was running out of explanations. It was on the fourth night after the scarecrow first appeared in my yard that things took a turn for the worse. I was in my living room, flipping through old books and half-forgotten notes on Ravenwood's history, hoping to find something, anything that might explain what was happening. That's when I saw it. Through the window, out in the backyard, a figure stood facing the pumpkin fields. At first, I thought it was another scarecrow, but something about it was off. Its limbs too rigid, its posture too human. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the figure wasn't just a scarecrow. It was dressed like one, rags and straw poking from its sleeves, but it was standing too straight, too aware. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my heart hammering in my chest. The cold night air bit at my skin as I approached the figure, the light from the flashlight flickering as I drew closer. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its back to me, staring out at the pumpkin fields as though waiting for something. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky in the stillness. "Who's there?" Slowly, almost deliberately, the figure turned its head. The movement was jerky, unnatural, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. Its face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, heavy and watchful, piercing through the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and the air around me grew cold, thick with something ancient and wrong. I took a step closer, the flashlight beam trembling as it swept over the figure's body. Its clothes hung loose, ragged and worn, stuffed with straw that poked out from the seams like brittle fingers. The air seemed to hum with a low, unearthly vibration, as though the very ground was alive beneath me. Just as I was within arm's reach, the figure shifted. Its head jerked upward, and for the first time, I saw its face. Rough, stitched fabric stretched over a hollow frame, its features twisted into a mockery of something human. And then it spoke, its voice raspy and broken. "You have forgotten the offerings. Now you have to pay." My heart hammered in my chest as the figure stared at me, its mouth unmoving, yet the words seemed to echo from deep within. Before I could react, it collapsed. One moment it was standing, the next it crumpled to the ground, its body falling apart into a heap of straw, bones, and tattered clothes. The wind picked up, swirling the straw around my feet, carrying with it the faint echo of the figure's final words. The offerings had been forgotten, and now the price was being collected. I ran back inside, slamming the door behind me, locking every bolt and latch. The image of those bones mixed with the straw haunted me as I sat by the window, waiting for dawn to come. The next day, the town was buzzing with excitement for the harvest festival. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel any of the usual joy. Something was wrong, deeply, profoundly wrong. I had to know what was happening, but I didn't know where to start. The festival kicked off just that afternoon. The streets were packed with people, the smell of cider heavy in the air. But beneath it all, there was an odor, like something rotting. I tried to shake the feeling of dread as I walked through the crowds, keeping my eyes on the scarecrows that lined the streets. Something about the townspeople was off. They moved mechanically, their faces blank, as though they were sleepwalking through the festivities, and several people were missing, regulars from the bar, people who should have been here. I tried to talk to Dave, my boss, but even he seemed distant, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by a strange, vacant look. No one seemed to notice the tension hanging in the air, or if they did, they were ignoring it. As the afternoon wore on, the sky grew dark with thick clouds that hovered unnaturally low. The air was charged, and I could feel something building, something waiting just beneath the surface. And then it happened. A loud crack echoed through the pumpkin fields, so sharp it felt like the ground itself had split open. A flock of crows took flight all at once, their wings beating the air in a deafening rush. The ground rumbled beneath our feet, and I saw it. Looming over the pumpkin field, the largest scarecrow. It had been missing for days, but now it was back, towering over the festival. But it wasn't just a scarecrow anymore. Its straw body had bloated, its limbs swollen with something ancient, something alive. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and the air around it hummed with power. The crowd froze, their blank expressions slowly shifting to fear as the scarecrow moved, its massive form creaking as it stepped forward. The scarecrows that lined the streets began to shift, their heads turning in unison to watch the crowd. One by one, they began to move, their straw bodies filled with the same malevolent energy as the towering figure in the field. Panic spread through the crowd, people screaming as they fled in all directions. But it was too late. The scarecrows were everywhere, and the festival grounds erupted into chaos. The rumble beneath our feet grew stronger, and I could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on the town. I ran, weaving through the terrified crowd, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't escape the feeling that the scarecrows were watching me, their eyes following my every step. The chaos was like nothing I had ever experienced in Ravenwood. People ran in every direction, knocking over stalls and trampling through the decorations that had taken weeks to set up. The air was thick with screams and the fluttering of thousands of crows, darkening the sky above, as if even they wanted to flee from whatever ancient force had awakened. My legs carried me as fast as they could, though I wasn't sure where I was going. There was no safety here. Not anymore. I glanced back toward the field, where the massive scarecrow still towered, its glowing eyes watching the crowd scatter beneath it. It hadn't moved again, but the threat of it was palpable. The smaller scarecrows, though, were a different story, their ragged straw limbs jerking as they chased down anyone in their path, moving with a slow but deliberate determination. I ran past the bar, my safe place, but even that seemed foreign now, like a relic of a town that no longer existed. I kept going, my breath hitching as I passed more scarecrows, some standing still, others slowly turning their heads toward me as I passed, their stitched faces following my every move. It was like the entire town had been overtaken by something that was always there, hiding just beneath the surface. After a few more minutes, I stopped. I didn't know what to do. The streets were nearly empty now, with only a few stragglers running toward their homes, desperate for safety. But deep down, I knew that no one would be safe tonight. Ravenwood had forgotten its history, forgotten the importance of the harvest offerings, and now the spirits, whatever they were angry, and they were taking what was owed. I turned toward the pumpkin field, heart pounding. The largest scarecrow still loomed over it, but now it seemed to be shifting, its bloated form creaking as it swayed slightly in the wind. The ground beneath my feet rumbled, and I saw cracks beginning to form in the earth, splitting the fields apart. As I stood there, frozen in place, I saw something else, a movement near the scarecrow. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it more clearly. People, townspeople, were standing at the edges of the field, staring up at the scarecrow with blank, unseeing eyes. Among them, I recognized the missing people from the festival. They stood there, motionless, their bodies swaying slightly in time with the scarecrow as though they were tethered to it. A cold dread settled in my chest. They weren't missing. They had been taken, claimed by whatever ancient force had been awakened. I don't know what pushed me forward, but I found myself walking toward the field, toward the towering scarecrow. The closer I got, the stronger the sour, decaying smell became, like the air itself was rotting. The crows still circled overhead, their cries piercing the heavy silence that had settled over the town. I stopped at the edge of the field, just a few feet away from the first row of pumpkins. They were all rotted now, their once vibrant orange skins shriveled and blackened, oozing a thick, foul-smelling liquid. The scarecrow's eyes glowed brighter, and for a moment I felt a strange pull, like it was beckoning me closer. But I didn't move. The townspeople standing in the field didn't acknowledge me, their eyes still fixed on the towering figure. They weren't themselves anymore. Whatever life had been in them was gone, replaced by the same ancient force that animated the scarecrows. I had no doubt that if I stepped into the field, I would be lost too, claimed by the harvest spirits, just like them. As I stood there trembling, I heard a sound behind me. I turned, half expecting to see another scarecrow approaching. Instead, it was Dave. He was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was a strange determination in his face that I hadn't seen before. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's too late to stop it now." "What's happening?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Dave shook his head, looking toward the field with a grim expression. "We've forgotten. The town forgot what the festival was really for. The offerings, the rituals, they were never just traditions. They were to keep the spirits of the harvest at peace. But we stopped, and now they're taking what's owed." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "The scarecrows? They're alive. They're not scarecrows anymore," Dave interrupted. "They're something much older. They've taken the people, the land, and they'll take more if we don't give them what they want." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a lead blanket. "What do they want?" Dave looked at me, his eyes filled with a sorrow I couldn't quite place. "They want a sacrifice. They always have." The ground trembled again, a low rumble that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. I glanced back at the scarecrow in the field, its glowing eyes now fixed directly on us. The air around it shimmered, heavy with an energy that felt ancient, dangerous. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Dave shook his head. "You can't outrun it. It's part of the land, part of the town. It will find you." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. I could feel it too, the pull, the connection between the scarecrows and the land itself. The town had ignored its history for too long, and now the harvest spirits were claiming their due. Dave reached into his jacket and pulled out a small carved pumpkin. It was pristine, perfectly round and untouched by the rot that had spread through the rest of the field. He handed it to me, his hand trembling. "I found this behind the bar this morning," he said. "There was a note with it. It said that we could still make an offering, that there's still a chance to stop this, but it's a small one." I stared at the pumpkin, my mind racing. An offering? What kind of offering? "The same kind our ancestors used to make," Dave replied, his voice tight. "Something precious, something alive." I felt the blood drain from my face. He didn't need to say it. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. The festival grounds were empty now, the streets deserted, save for the scarecrows that still stood watch over the town and the townspeople who had been taken. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as though the earth itself was preparing to give way. I stood in the middle of the pumpkin field, the small carved pumpkin clutched tightly in my hands. The towering scarecrow loomed above me, its glowing eyes watching, waiting. The townspeople, those who had been taken, stood at the edge of the field, silent and unmoving, their faces blank. Dave stood beside me, his expression grim. He hadn't said much since we'd arrived. There wasn't much left to say. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the only chance we had. Slowly I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, fully expecting that this would be my last act. I placed the pumpkin at the base of the towering scarecrow, bracing myself for the moment it would take me. The air around me seemed to hum with a strange, pulsating energy, and I felt it pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. My breath caught in my throat as I waited for the inevitable. For a moment, a voice drifted on the wind, a whisper, low and ancient, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. The sound chilled me to the bone, and I felt the pull of something old and powerful, ready to claim me. The ground rumbled beneath my feet and the scarecrow's glowing eyes flickered. The air around it shimmered, and for a brief moment I saw something else, a figure standing in the scarecrow's place. It was old, every part of it looked wrong, disjointed, broken, yet held together by something dark, something older than the town, older than the land. The air around it seemed to warp and bend, thick with an unsettling presence, as if reality itself recoiled from its existence. Then suddenly, the figure vanished. The scarecrow stood still once more, its glow fading. The air grew cold and still, and the ground stopped shaking. I was still there, alive. I looked toward the edge of the field where the townspeople had been standing, those blank, lifeless faces that had been frozen, as though held in place by some unseen force. They were still there, but as the last shimmer of light faded from the scarecrow's eyes, they began to collapse. One by one, their bodies crumpled to the ground, their limbs falling into twisted, unnatural positions like rag dolls being discarded. I ran toward them, my heart pounding in my chest, but I already knew there was nothing left. The townspeople, the ones who had been taken, were gone. What remained were only hollow shells, their bodies filled with nothing but straw and dust, the remnants of the harvest spirit's claim. They had been sacrificed, taken as part of the offering, their lives traded for the town's temporary reprieve. I knelt beside one of them, staring into the empty, stitched face of what had once been a living person. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just a quiet, eerie stillness. The spirits had taken them. It was over. The aftermath was quiet, almost eerily so. The festival grounds were destroyed, the pumpkins rotted and crushed beneath the weight of the panic that had swept through the town. No one spoke about what had happened. The harvest spirits had been appeased for now, but I knew that it wasn't over. The offering had bought us time, but it hadn't ended the cycle. I returned to the bar, exhausted but alive. The familiar hum of the place felt hollow now, as though something vital had been taken. I sat behind the counter, staring at the empty stools, the weight of everything that had happened settling over me. As I reached for a bottle of whiskey, I noticed something on the counter, a small, perfectly intact pumpkin again. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. Tucked inside was another note, written in the same spidery handwriting. For now, we rest, but the harvest always comes again. I sat there for a long time, staring at the pumpkin, knowing that next year, the spirits would return